I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. I hope everyone had a wonderful long weekend. I don't usually take long weekends off unless they're like religious holidays. But given that Easter happened during the election, we didn't really take any time off around here at Juno News. I took the day with my family, and I have to say, I'm feeling very refreshed and energized to start the week, and great to be back with you. Now, folks, you know this, and I know this. The legacy media is lying to you. They are lying to you. They are pretending that they are neutral, that they're the arbiters of facts and the truth, but they're not. And so we decided here at Juno News to do an analysis. We actually worked with ChatGPT, which is an AI search engine, and had ChatGPT analyze all of the news stories by the legacy media during the election and assign them a score. And I'm going to walk you through this report today on the show, and you will be surprised. I was surprised by who the worst offender, who the absolute worst, most biased media outlet is in Canada. We're going to get to that very shortly. First, I am pleased to be joined for this episode by my friend Hamish Marshall. Hamish is a director at One Persuasion, which is a polling company and a government relations firm based in Ontario. He was our in-house pollster during the 2021 federal election. Before that, in 2019, he was the national campaign manager for the Conservative Party, and he ran Andrew Scheer's winning leadership campaign. This time around, we had his colleague David Murray, also of One Persuasion, as our in-house pollster. And I know we all very much enjoyed having David's insights during the campaign. But Hamish, it's great to have you back on the show. How are you?
It's great to be here. It's fantastic. It was nice to take the long weekend away with the kids as well.
Great. Well, I want to walk through this report that we just put out at Juno News because I think it tells us what we all knew, which is that the media lies to us. The media is biased. And so I'll just explain what we did. We worked with the search engine, the AI search engine, ChatGPT, and had them look at every single article that was published by the legacy media throughout the course of the campaign. And we had them assign a score. So they looked at the stories that focused on Mark Carney, and if the story was very favorable to Mark Carney, he got a +2. If it was somewhat favorable, +1. If it was neutral, 0. And then if it was critical, they got -1, and very critical, -2. And then they did the same thing for Pierre Poilievre. So first I'll talk about CTV. CTV came in third place, the third worst offender in our list here. And overall, looking at all the stories in the campaign, Carney had a score of +3, whereas Poilievre had a -9. So you could just tell just from that Poilievre was viewed much more negatively by CTV, Carney much more positively, +3. Second place, second worst offender was CBC. And this may surprise you. I would have assumed that they were the worst, but they're
Me
not. They're the
too.
second worst. So they had Mark Carney +5 and Pierre Poilievre -11. I don't think that would surprise anyone that Poilievre was painted in a negative light for more often than not. In fact, when we looked at the stories, we couldn't find any examples of very positive coverage of Pierre Poilievre. But the worst offender, Hamish, was the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail, they're seen as the national newspaper of record in Canada, like to put themselves as being, honest, sincere journalists. But they had Mark Carney at +9 and Pierre Poilievre at -15, which was the biggest delta, the biggest difference, the most negative coverage. So Canadians that are consuming their news from these outlets, I would say these are probably the biggest, the most popular ones, CBC, CTV on television, and then the Globe and Mail is still probably the most read newspaper in Canada. All of them would have given you a very negative impression of Pierre Poilievre, positive of Mark Carney. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely shocked. I would have thought the CBC would be worse as well. But the Globe and Mail, Mark Carney is the Globe and Mail's sort of liberal. He presents himself, of course, as this pragmatic, business-friendly liberal, and not the eco-radical that it's pretty clear from his book that he is. He's a sort of liberal that they would have loved to support, and I think we can see in these figures that have come out that's clearly where their mind's at. The thing that maybe helped the CBC not get the worst place prize was that what I found in the election is if there was a story that was bad about Carney, something had happened, he'd had to fire a candidate or something objectively bad happened, the CBC just wouldn't cover it. So they wouldn't even write a story they wouldn't try to make a bad story look a bit better or put a positive spin on it. They just simply wouldn't mention it at all. So I wonder how much that had an impact on making the CBC not appear quite as bad as the Globe and Mail.
Well, I think that there's also been like a decade of preconditioning for the CBC, or probably longer, right?
Yeah.
But the one thing I noticed throughout the entire Trump era, the first time around his first presidency, was that the CBC lead story would always be Trump related. Like it didn't matter how big of a scandal Justin Trudeau had gotten himself into, how horrible, something horrible that he had done for our country. The lead story on the national news for CBC was always Orange Man bad, Trump terrible. So you're right. In some ways, it's like they don't even need to cover the Canadian election in a certain way. It's just the choice of what stories they covered, and I'm sure that that happened during this campaign where they were, you know, lead story was something horrible about Donald Trump, which would make which make Canadians who were watching feel fearful without even mentioning the Canadian election. And this is something that we have. And so overall, we did something called the Tilt Scoreboard. And so this is a number from 1 to 10. So if you're a 1, you were tilting heavily towards Mark Carney. If you were a 10, you would have been tilting heavily towards Pierre Poilievre. A 5 would be neutral. The Globe and Mail score, tilt score, was a 1. CBC News was somewhere between a 2 or a 3, and CTV was 3. So none of them even close to neutral. They were all markedly, heavily pro Carney in this campaign. And in some ways it's predictable, but it's such a disservice when you look at how close the election was. I haven't had you on since the election results came in. We had the Conservatives coming in at around 41%, the Liberals coming in at around 43%. That's a close election. Even if it didn't translate necessarily that way, it looks like Carney's going to find a way to edge as close to a majority government as possible. But with such a close campaign, I think it's clear that the media was the deciding factor in this campaign. What do you think?
Oh, I think they were absolutely a huge asset in Carney's arsenal, no question. I think it's also interesting that these most biased media are, in television and newspapers, and there's a skew there towards older viewers and older readers, older people. We've seen that there was a huge age difference in this campaign, where younger people supported the Conservatives at a much higher level, and Liberals were much more likely to be over 55, over 65. And I think it's not a coincidence that, I don't know anybody. I'm 46. I don't know anybody my age who has cable anymore. I don't know people who watch CBC News anymore. But my who are my age, my parents do. And I think the demographic of people who still watch the legacy media is very much older, and I don't think there's a coincidence. That's a coincidence. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg. Perhaps they gave their viewers who were already leaning that way something that they were expecting. They played to their audience, but on the other hand, it probably also influenced a large chunk of their audience to give Carney a second look, or to give them reasons not to vote Conservative. So. But the great news is that as this process keeps happening, as this mainstream media becomes less and less relevant as time goes on with each passing week.
Well, I want to visit the polls with you because I know you're a pollster, and we here at Juno News, we're quite critical. Actually, we're so skeptical, Hamish, of the legacy media that that's why we decided to do our own Juno polls throughout the campaign. We worked with David Murray, and we had our own look. So, like, when I talk to friends, people are like, "Oh, were you surprised or disappointed by the election outcome?" I'm like, "No, that's pretty much what I thought would happen because we had the polls, and the numbers that David was giving us is pretty much exactly what it turned into on election night, off by a point or two." But I did notice that the legacy media and their mainstream polls, and specifically the polling aggregators, did not get things quite so accurate. And so we've talked about this on the show before, that many of the legacy media outlets were projecting that it was going to be a big Liberal blowout, that the Liberals were going to get historic numbers. Some of the polling at the very end had the Conservatives polling in the sort of mid to upper 30s, where they ended up getting 41%. I don't think anyone accurately projected the numbers as they came in. I'm curious, though, what's your perspective? Are you as skeptical about the pollsters as I am?
No, look. I'm a professional pollster, so and I believe most, not maybe not all, but most people in this industry are trying to do their best to get the right numbers. There's parameters, there's things that make that difficult, but I think they're coming there with the intention of being accurate. What I will say is that on average, when you look at the final results and you look at what the pollsters had Conservatives, they were down about, on average, about 2% lower than what the Conservatives actually got. I think it works out to sort of 39.7. I'm not sure. Something 39 point something. if you look at the final poll of
I
all.
I have the final vote based on the aggregate from 338. So they had the Liberal Party at 42. They projected the Conservatives would come in at 39, NDP 9, Bloc 6, Green 2. Compare that to what actually happened was that the Liberals finished at 43.8, Conservatives 41.3, NDP at 6.3, Bloc at 6.3, and Green at 1.2. So yeah, they look like they got the Conservatives wrong by 2.3% and the Liberals by 1.8%.
Yeah, so like that's pretty accurate. These polls often have a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. So those numbers are not they're not. I don't think that's an indictment of the industry. And they got there in the end. It's also a bit systematic. If you go back and look at the last two elections, conservative votes, the final predictions before the election, they always underestimate conservative vote by an average of about 2%. But it's not like it's 8%. There's a couple of pollsters that are way off, of course, but on average, the numbers are, especially if they were down by the Liberals by a couple of points, it's not that bad. What I think happened, and like what I saw in the campaign was that we obviously saw polling that in some cases earlier in the campaign, a couple of weeks into the campaign, showed the Conservatives down 8, 10, 12 points, depending on the pollster. And we were hearing from conservative campaigners this incredible response at the door, and there was this dichotomy. What ended up happening is that first of all, a couple of things happened. One is I think as the last 3 weeks of the campaign, the Conservatives ran a very good campaign in the last 3 weeks of the campaign and made up a lot of votes and actually gained momentum throughout the campaign. And if the campaign had got another week or two, I think the results could have been very, very different. The other thing that happened is that Conservatives at the doors were getting good results because conservatives were finding support at the doors at a level higher than they're ever used to being. To get 41.4% of the vote as the Conservatives did in the end, that's a higher level than any party in Canada since the 1988 federal election. So any conservative that's been involved in campaigning at any point since, say, 1993 has been used to seeing lower results at the doors overall. This felt very good on the ground, and we heard anecdotal stories. I know your reporters found anecdotal stories of lots of people out supporting conservatives because conservatives did far better than they ever had historically. They got 8 million votes. I mean, no party had ever gotten more than 7 million in the past. And frankly, what Carney profited from more than anything else wasn't the strength of the Liberal Party, but the complete and utter collapse of the NDP. This is, I think Pierre Poilievre said it after the election. If Conservatives had gotten 41.4 in any other election in the last 30 years, it would have been an absolute blowout. And the circumstances were different, and obviously it didn't work out this way. But the coalition that has been built, that in the end, I think is extremely exciting and extremely powerful. And if Poilievre can build on that into the next election, he's going to have an incredible base.
Well, it's true. I remember talking to some friends who were out campaigning, specifically in Toronto in the GTA, and they said, "I don't care what the pollsters say. This feels like a winning campaign. It feels like we're winning." And I was looking at the numbers, and I was saying, "Yeah, that's because it's possible that Poilievre will get a higher percentage of the vote than Stephen Harper ever did,
Yep.
and still lose to a majority Liberal government." I'm just pleased that the Conservatives were able to hold Carney to a minority, although it looks like it's getting pretty close and pretty tight. So overall, Hamish, like, what is your analysis? Do you think that Poilievre ran a good campaign? Is he going to stay on as leader? When do you think the next election will be? Do you think Carney will be able to put together a majority here, or do you think that we'll have a minority that typically lasts, 18 to 24 months?
Oh, so there's a lot in that. Look, I think the campaign was well run. I think the campaign, especially the last 3 weeks, really came together. Poilievre's performance in the debates, I think, were a very strong asset for him. He did very well. And I think that we saw over that time the conservative base grow and got them out to vote in a good way. Obviously, not enough. More needs to be done. But I think the campaign, especially the part, particularly in April, was very, very good. Um, I think that Poilievre should and will stay on. I think he's got the support of the vast majority of conservatives. And even the people I know who didn't support him in the leadership when he ran it, when he won 3 years ago, are now saying things like, "Well, last thing we need is more leadership turmoil. We've been dumping leaders after each election. Let's have some continuity. Let's build from here." So I think he's going to stay on as leader. And whether I don't think Carney is going to get to a majority. There's 2 seats left to be recounted. The Liberals are on paper ahead in one, and the Conservatives are on paper ahead in the other. The one the Conservatives are head in, I think, is going to it's by enough that it would be very, very difficult to be overcome in a recount. The one the Liberals are ahead in is only 12 votes. Anyway, we'll see what happens there, but I don't think he's going to get to a majority. Look, the biggest thing for him is for Carney's ability to stay on comes down to the revival of the NDP. The Bloc, we'll see what they do. They said they don't want an election for a year. They need to raise money. If the Bloc's polling numbers get good in Quebec, I think we'll see them going on the warpath, but that's not enough. It's going to come down to the NDP or what's left of the Greens, I suppose, depending on what the actual numbers are in the end. And the NDP leadership, I don't think is going to be that quick. I think we're going to see the NDP take a year, 18 months, and I don't think there's any chance of there being an election until the NDP have a new leader and have maybe shown some signs of life and stop polling in single digits.
Well, we showed this image on the show, I think last week, that in Canada, I think that the rebate you get a rebate from the government. The taxpayers subsidize political parties if you get 10% of the vote in a riding, and I think the NDP missed that in the overwhelming majority, like 85% or something like that. So. We've talked about this a lot at Juno News and on the Candice Malcolm Show that the NDP has financial problems and they take on a lot of debt to run these campaigns. And part of the reason, I know part of the reason why Jagmeet Singh never triggered an election was because he wanted his pension or because he wanted to be in that power seat. And he said that he was doing everything he could to block the Conservatives from getting into government, which is not really his job. But anyway, I think a big part of it that is unspoken is that the finances of that party are in shambles. And right now they don't have a leader. So I don't see any incentive whatsoever for them to try to force another election when they just aren't organized and don't have that. I do want to talk about Pierre Poilievre, though, because it seems like we're going to have a parliament without Poilievre at first anyway. CTV was reporting that the clock starts ticking on the by-election of Poilievre as he hopes to return to parliament. So according to federal law, Damien Carrick, who stepped aside so that Poilievre could take a seat, they're saying that he must sit as member of parliament for 30 days before he can tender his resignation. After that, the Speaker of the House of Commons would have to report the vacancy to the chief electoral officer, at which point the government would have 11 to 180 days to call a by-election. By-elections can last minimum 36 days, so the soonest that Poilievre could be elected would be early August. There's, of course, a holiday in early August, so we might not be talking until the second week of August. Now, Mark Carney had previously said that he won't delay and that he'll get Poilievre the opportunity with a by-election as fast as possible. We have a clip of him saying that. Let's play that.
I've already indicated to Mr. Poilievre that if it's the decision of him and the Conservative Party to trigger, if I can put it that way, a by-election, I will ensure that it happens as soon as possible.
Okay.
No games, nothing, straight.
Yeah, so the CBC was like applauding him and cheering him on last week, saying, what a great guy. He's not even being partisan. He's just letting Poilievre have a seat right away. But then, of course, these convoluted rules step in, and it looks like we are going to have a summer without Poilievre in the House. What do you make of all this? And strategically, what do you think Poilievre should be doing?
Well, look, I think these are the rules. The reason they have to wait 30 days is that 30 days is the time that someone can legally challenge the outcome of an election. So, in theory, if someone could file a challenge saying Damien Carrick cheated and therefore shouldn't be the MP, then he wouldn't be allowed to resign. So they have to wait for that 30-day period to be gone in order for him to allow it to be resign. Look, I frankly think that that it's going to be a very short session of Parliament starting next week or whenever it is, very soon. It'll be over in 3 or 4 weeks. Mr. Poilievre, I'm sure, will be around the House of Commons. Will still be able to scrum in front of the House of Commons as he always did. And we'll have a few less clips of him in question period, but he'll be back in the House for the return of the House in September, which is when things will start getting really, really interesting. I think Carney and most of his MPs are probably still finding their way to the washroom right now and around the House of the Commons. I don't expect this first session to be particularly exciting. So I don't think it makes a massive difference. Of course, we'll have, as I said, a few less clips of Poilievre tearing the Liberals to shreds in the House, but I think we can all manage for a few weeks. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. And it gets an opportunity for Poilievre to spend the summer out doing the barbecue circuit as well. So I don't think it's a big problem.
Now, so one of the big news stories to come out of last week was that the Carney Liberals will not table a budget this spring. They claim that they don't have time. And so instead, we won't get one until the fall. Of course, we didn't get one. The fall economic budget, it was kind of in shambles. That was right when Chrystia Freeland was resigning. And it seems to me we don't have any sort of financial accountability right now. And, given that Mark Carney said that he's here to help manage the crisis, that this is a crisis that we're dealing with the tariffs, it just seems wildly irresponsible for someone as professional and grown up and, mature as we're told that Mark Carney is. He's the man for crisis, that he can't even get a budget put out. So his finance minister, Francois Philippe Champagne, basically just said that the world has changed in the last 6 weeks and that Canadians understand that. Therefore, we don't need a budget. Let's play that clip.
I want to ask you explicitly, will there be an actual budget in 2025?
There will be a fall economic statement when we're coming back.
How are we as Canadians to hold your government accountable for what you're promising if you're not going to be transparent about it for 6 months or so? And I take your point about the timeline, throne speech. There's still another month.
And I would say this is a new government. So let's start, if we're going to start, this is a new government, new legislature, new prime minister. So the direction is very clear. He's been
But you're still the finance minister.
Yeah, I'm still the finance minister. And I would say the world has changed also in 6 weeks. So Canadians understand that.
What? Oh, what do you make of that, Hamish?
I mean, I think it's outrageous, right? I mean, I think one of the most important things we always have to remember about Liberals is what they say and what they do is different. And we should always measure them on what they do, not what they say. Because they often say things that at first glance seem very reasonable or smart and actually end up doing terrible things. Carney has come up with this whole brand of being this responsible fiscal manager. And instead we get this idea that, we might not have a budget all this year. He's now backtracked a little and indicated there might be one, or he'll just rename the fall economic statement as a budget. The fact of the matter that he thought that it would be acceptable for him to, get elected, claiming to be all new, all different, as a new type of Liberal, and then not have a budget on his supposed strength in economics, shows that he's actually not a new type of Liberal. He's very, very much in the vein of Justin Trudeau and everything we've seen in the past. And that sort of arrogance and dismissal of the way the government's supposed to work, of the accountability that Canadians desire, I think is going to become a real ring around his neck. He's really going to be. I think we're going to discover that the bloom is going to come off this guy very, very, very fast. The smartest thing he ever did was call that election as fast as he did. I just remember Stephen Harper getting elected in January of 2006, and there was still a budget in March. They managed to do that. I don't know why Mr. Carney couldn't have a budget in June. I'm not saying he has to have one this week, but you could have one in June sometime. That's a reasonable amount of time. He's got a platform full of things he thinks are great they should do. They can cut and paste that in large parts into a budget. It doesn't have to, this is something that is doable. He just didn't think he needed to do it. He isn't actually planning on delivering the change he promised. And I think that's a real problem for him. And, Canadians have every right to be annoyed and disappointed.
Well, you're right. I think that to a lot of Canadians, clearly, they felt that Carney was the change that the country needed. They felt satisfied with the change within the Liberal leadership and said, we'll give Mark Carney a chance. And I think last week should have been a real eye-opener for many of those Canadians because, sure, Carney's totally different than Justin Trudeau. He was advising behind the scene for some period of Trudeau's tenure, but still, he has his own experience, his own person. He steps in and he does represent some kind of change. But then for him to release that cabinet and introduce all of the same characters, like how is it that Canada is going to turn around its fortunes when he still has Melanie Joly, Stéphane Guilbeault, Chrystia Freeland, and yes, Francois Philippe Champagne running the show, right? Like, we're supposed to be impressed by his resume and his Rolodex and all of his connections. Like, where are all these high profile, globalist types that could step in, right? Why isn't he pulling people from Scotiabank and RBC or, London and New York and Goldman Sachs and all of these like impressive people who have saved companies and built empires? Like, why aren't any of them stepping in? Why do we have this same pathetic group of people that were standing side by side with Justin Trudeau and destroyed the country? That's a bit of a rhetorical question. I want to point out that Mark Carney was in Rome. He was speaking to reporters, and he said that there's not much value in a budget that Canadians just don't really need to know? Not much value. Let's play that clip.
There is not much value in my judgment, and it's considered judgment, and it's judgment based on experience, that there is not much value in trying to rush through a budget in a very narrow window, 3 weeks, with a new cabinet, effectively a new finance minister.
Effectively, no, Champagne was the finance minister before the election as well, and it's a new cabinet. No, I mean, there's 1 or 2 new faces. I mean, there are some new faces. Many of them will be familiar. Someone like Evan Solomon is a new face, but he's a longtime Liberal insider. Same with Gregor Robertson, the longtime mayor of Vancouver, who was an abject failure in that role, and now he's a housing minister. So, you have sort of a new cabinet, but not really. Most of them are Trudeau-era Liberal cabinet ministers. The new faces are not that new. What do you make of all that?
Well, look, I think he's making a huge mistake with putting a lot of these traditional ministers, these old Trudeau ministers, in these senior positions of power. Because I will tell you something. I worked in the Prime Minister's office many years ago, and the government of Canada is a large, unwieldy beast, and it's only become larger since I was there. It's got so many moving parts. And the prime minister can make change. If the prime minister puts his direct personal attention on an issue, he can get the department to do something dramatically different. But it takes force of will, and there's just too many things for any one human to do, which is why we have a cabinet. But in many cases, especially if you've got weak cabinet ministers or cabinet ministers who don't really want to do what the prime minister, wants them to do, or sort of don't feel the urgency, is that things will just drift along. The bureaucratic inertia in Ottawa is incredible. And if you've got a weak minister or a minister who doesn't really want to change things will not change. Things will continue in exactly the same path. So even if we take Carney at his word and believe he wants to change things, which I don't, and I think that would be a mistake, but even if we believe he wants to change things, the fact that he's got a bunch of Trudeau retreads who don't really want to change things, and weak other ministers, many of whom have been elected for 15 minutes, really indicates to me that we're going to see very much more of the same and very little change. The way he's dismissive of the budget, I think, is a big mistake. Like, I spent a lot of time polling Canadians and working in politics. There's not we all pay attention to politics far more than the average person. But there are a few big things that people pay attention to. People know that the budget matters. Interest in politics spikes around budgets, whether it's provincial budget or a federal budget. That's a thing that it's a big set piece that governments see as an asset. The fact that he doesn't even see it as a potential asset to drive his own message says a lot about him. And how sort of dismissive he is of the way that Canadians interact with politics to understand what's going on. And his very much attitude is, things are fine, just trust me, I've got it under control. And, I think that's a big mistake on his part.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that his priorities have been shown, right? Like, he got selected leader by the Liberal convention, and I think the next day he jumped on an airplane and went to France and then the UK. Here he is in Rome. He's preparing for the G7 meeting, which I think is going to be like the highlight for him of being prime minister, is that he gets to host this G7 meeting in Canada, and he talks about it a lot. Seems to me that his priorities are not inside Canada, not the budget. So him not doing a budget, I think, perfectly reflects that.
Most prime ministers, especially ones who are long serving, go through a period where they get elected, they're very focused on domestic issues, and 6, 7, 8 years in, domestic issues are a little less interesting. They've been dealing with them intently for a few years, and they get more involved in international politics. And that happens to all prime ministers, the good ones and the bad ones. There's a draw of internationalism, usually at some point, year 6 or 7. With Carney, it seems to start on day 6 or 7. Instantly. The fact that he's been prime minister for 8, 9 weeks and he's been to Europe twice is mind blowing. And you're right. He's going to be, his greatest disappointment of the G7 is that it's being held here and he doesn't get to go to Europe again.
Well, I think he loves hosting it. I think he's going to really lean into that. And that again, yeah, he's definitely looking forward to that much more than being held accountable in the House of Commons. Well, Hamish Marshall, great to have you back on the show. Always appreciate your insights and your commentary. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, folks, thanks so much. That's all the time we have today. We'll be back again tomorrow with all the news. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you and God bless.